So, hi everybody. Thanks for coming. This is how we're going to do it. I'm going to do something I have never really done before, which is do a reading from the book, and then Zephyr and I are going to have a conversation. So that's the way it's going to be. I want to say thanks again. Also, buying the book. I appreciate that. Every author would like to be in this place. And I also want to say that Zephyr and I, we ran for office together. So we used to do events all the time. I think this is one of the very few times we've actually done an event together since then. So it's a special honor. And as you may have noticed, Zephyr has her newborn child with her. So that's we're all very privileged for that. So let me take a reading from the book. And this is taken from the basic idea of this book is that I've come to believe that we're facing kind of challenges politically and economically that seem incredibly daunting, but that at some level we've faced them before. That this nation once before was dominated by large concentrated industries, enormous monopolies, trusts as they were once called. This nation before faced an onslaught of a kind of a new radical politics, the danger, this nation and also the world, the danger of a different kind of appeal based on the anger of people who felt that the economic system wasn't treating them. And I think this nation before has faced those challenges in ways we need to learn from, lest we repeat some of the most serious errors of the 20th century. I think that during the progressive era and during the New Deal, the United States learned that it needed to face the true threat of private power, the fact that there's something undemocratic in an unaccountable monopoly or unaccountable oligopoly that begins to enjoy a certain sway over your life that transcends that of government, that leaves people with a feeling they have no control over their economic and therefore political destiny, that leaves the population with a sense of hopelessness and a yearning for revolution, sometimes translated into very dangerous yearning for a strong man who will come and solve all their problems, make the nation great again, go to war with enemies, domestic and foreign. So I think we're living in very dangerous times. I think we need to relearn some of the history, the lessons of the past. And I believe one of the root things we need to do is get at the source of many of our problems, which is concentrated industrial power, excessive monopolization, and too much unaccountability for private business. That's basically this book in a nutshell. And let me read. Let me read from part of from part of this. So here we are, in an earlier time. This is in the first Gilded Age, and we have. I'll say a little bit about the first Gilded Age. As I said, it was all about. It was a period of great monopolization. The economy, as in our time, was transformed. Once thousands and thousands of small businesses were destroyed, replaced with a few sort of industrial titans. We know them as Standard Oil and maybe the U.S. Steel Company, but actually it was the entire economy. There were trusts for tobacco, trusts for cotton. I said trusts for steel, trusts for nails, trusts for every single industry was ruled by a single entity. Now that had certain advantages for the owners of the trust. They call it for the Gilded Age for a reason. It conveyed enormous wealth upon individuals. But they preferred to clothe their ambitions in slightly more noble garb. And that's the part I'm going to read. That's the part I'm going to read to you right now. Monopolists like to portray themselves as part of a progressive movement, striving toward a better age, and justified their work using the then fashionable ideology of social Darwinism and the writings of its English exponent, Herbert Spencer. Not well known in our times, except perhaps as crudely reflected in the writings of novelist Ayn Rand or the monopoly worship of Peter Thiel and other Silicon Valley thinkers, Spencer provided the philosophy for the conquering tycoon, and even for some, a personal religion. Here was the faith. Led by the strongest and greatest of men, society was in the midst of an evolutionary transformation whose goal was nothing less than the forging of a new world order. The weak, the small, and the old-fashioned were being all swept away to be replaced by the new, the scientific, and above all, the strong. For some, this purge displaced not just old ways and inefficient businesses, but Christianity as well, with its regard for the disadvantaged and insistence on humility before God. Many social Darwinists believe less in humanity's sinful nature than in man's perfectibility, personified in the image of man looking to the sun, aspiring to godlike qualities. The meek were not going to inherit the earth, but be eliminated through the process of the survival of the fittest. In politics, social Darwinists embrace laissez-faire, opposing any interventions that might be thought to stop the strong from displacing the weak. Spencer opposed poor laws in Britain, believing that the impoverished should be left to live or die on their own, so as to clear the world for them and make room for better, in quotes. To be fair, he and other social Darwinists did lend support to one form of state intervention, eugenic campaigns meant to cull the physically and mentally disabled, and thereby help speed the coming of the new age. Joseph D. Rockefeller Jr. would personally fund an initiative to sterilize some 15 million Americans for, as Spencer put it, the forces which are working out the great scheme of perfect happiness, exterminate such sections of mankind as stand in their way, with the same sternness that they exterminate beasts of prey and herds of useless ruminants. As between men, so would it be for business. Nothing, certainly not government, should try to stop the great monopolists in their conquest of the economy. For what was underway was a kind of industrial eugenics campaign that exterminated the weak and the unfit to make room for firms great and powerful. John D. Rockefeller put it this way: the American beauty rose can be produced in the splendor and fragrance only by sacrificing the early buds which would grow around it. This is what the trust movement's underlying philosophy and vision of what an economy should be: centralized, run by great men, free from any government interference, and to promote survival of the fittest, largely indifferent to the plight or demise of the weak, the poor, or the unfit. It cannot be denied that some of the firms built during this era were impressive creations, and that the American economy as a whole experienced impressive, if not wholly unprecedented, growth. But the monopolization movement also marked a radical break from values once seen as foundational to the Republic, if not in the more humanist traditions of Western civilization. As historian Richard Hofstadter put it, nothing less was at stake than the entire organization of American business and American politics, the very question of who is going to control the country. For the American tradition had been, to that point, defined by resistance to centralized power and monopoly. The American Revolution itself was in large part sparked by the abuses of crown monopoly. The original Boston Tea Party was, after all, really an anti-monopoly protest. The question of who ruled the country was suddenly unclear, and fortifying matters was, I want to read this. And as Hofstadter writes, from its colonial beginnings through the 19th century, America was overwhelmingly a nation of farmers, small-town entrepreneurs, ambitious, mobile, optimistic, speculative, anti-authoritarian, egalitarian, and competitive. As time went on, Americans took it for granted that property would be widely diffused, that economic and social power would be decentralized. Perhaps most profound was a break with the ideal that the United States was a nation characterized by a relative sense of equality among its citizens. As Alex de Tocqueville observed, among the novel objects that attracted my attention during my stay in the United States, nothing struck me more forcefully than the general equality of condition among the people. But that was no longer true for small business, farmers, and especially workers. Looking back, the difference in incomes was so stark it makes today's America look like Scandinavia. The wealthy might earn millions a year, the average worker between $1 and $2 a day. So let me start with that. Thanks.
So thank you, and this will be an experiment. If Dashiell cries, I may leave, and I'll take it on to you to continue the questioning. But I really did want to be here. I really, as you know, admire Tim's work enormously and think this book couldn't come at a more important time.
Exactly.
So I have a broad question, but just since you read that passage, I think what it begs, the question it begs is, what do you see as the sort of modern ideology? And we'll talk in a second about who you think the modern monopolists are.
Right.
But you were in that passage describing not just a fact, but an ideology, sort of a way of understanding what ought to be. And what do you see the modern monopolists, which you're going to describe in a minute, as what is the core ideology? What's similar to the Spencer ideology and what's different? Or is there a similar ideology? Do you see a similar ideology?
I'd say the core of it, the idea that has persisted, never really gone away, is the idea that business, and particularly big business, has almost its own sovereignty, that they are beyond regulation, that it would be wrong, that they cannot be regulated, that would interfere with the natural order of things, and that it is both wrong-headed and sort of ultimately doomed to fail. That, I think, is the ideology that, frankly, has been very widely adopted, even by the Democratic Party. There's something hopeless about it. There's a passage I didn't quote, but Rockefeller's general counsel says, to try to stop the formation of monopoly, you might as well try to stop the sun from coming up or the rain from falling. And so I think the most powerful myth that I think is powerful to displace, that we did displace in the early 20th century, is the mythology that there is a naturalness to inequality, that there is a naturalness and something like God ordained. I mean, they were more explicit. Some people just said this is God's will, that some men are great and other men are low and shall serve the other. I mean, some people thought that. I think it's said a little more politely today, but I think underlying it is the stark view that the state of nature is one where there are a few people very rich and very powerful, and the rest are sort of meant to be serving them or suffering or perhaps eliminated. I know that's extreme, and no one says it explicitly, but I think underlying it is kind of that belief that it's all nature and all nature, and there's nothing you can really do about it.
Well, what about the sort of the belief in the creative destruction, which has obviously seized at least some part of the intellectual life of this country, that there may not be natural rulers and we need not worry about natural rulers because a new natural ruler, like if Facebook messes up, never fear, there will be another natural ruler to come. Do you see any tension between those, or do you see those as similar?
Yeah, I think they're so maybe the arguments have sort of matured a little bit. So in the old days, there was this idea there's certain men who are anointed to rule, and they obviously have risen to, like John Rockefeller or J.P. Morgan. They're obviously better than anybody else because look how rich they are, and so that's it. Today, there's some sense, well, maybe that's not the most accountable kind of theory. So people say, well, if a company, let's say like Facebook, ever strays, you don't have to worry because the saying is competition's a one click away. They will fall, that nature will take care of them. That's what I mean about nature, that naturally these problems will all solve themselves. So we don't have to worry. Government can stay with, let's say, defense or something. But as you say, that all these problems are sort of self-fixing. And at some level that we live in the best of all possible worlds, and any kind of idea of messing with this is going to create problems. Now that's a little bit of exaggeration, but I think in the heart of hearts, if you look into sort of the deepest part of contemporary American capitalism, I think it still has that basic idea. So accountability is kind of baked in.
So now let's get to the sort of big picture. First of all, what motivated you to write this book at this time?
I felt that, obviously I said, let me answer that more than one way. I think it might have been working in law enforcement. So I worked in the Obama administration in more than one capacity. One of them was enforcing the antitrust laws. And, very well-intentioned people. and thoughtful, no dummies. But somehow, I look back, and I basically have concluded we blew it. And I kind of wanted, I mean, it's sort of like...
Who's the we here?
We being the enforcement personnel of the Obama administration, right? So I didn't quite fully, I didn't make this a book like how we blew it. Maybe I should have. But I think that, we were playing the wrong game. We had a kind of faith that the economic ideology we had inherited was a fair game, that it would work. But we oversaw this incredible concentration of the U.S. economy based on a sort of failed, what ended up, I think, being a failed economic ideology, at least in terms of the goals that President Obama himself believed in. He often said we need to, and many campaign speeches, that we are facing an equality crisis in this country, and people want to know that this is still a land of opportunity for everybody. But we didn't really execute on this problem of market concentration. I mean, it sounds kind of technical. I think by the very end, the last 2 years, there was almost like a panic inside the White House where people were like, oh my God, look what's happening to the economy. Look what's happened to inequality, and how did we let this happen? And let's do something, and then we lost the election. So right when people were really waking up, and frankly, if you have to go, but I'm so.
Speaking
by the way,
waking up.
Thank you so much for coming with a new book.
Sorry, I thought this might work because but I'm going to take a break. But I'll ask a big, broad question before I take a break. So, could you describe when you talk? I actually want to return to the really interesting thought that maybe the Obama administration. Democrats blew it. But could you describe what you see as the current monopolization of the economy? Like, what is it that you see that we face right now?
Sure. Zephyr, it's so incredible of you to, I'm blown away by the fact you've even made the effort to come here, so I really, really deeply appreciate it. What was the question, Jess? No, she wanted to ask me about the... I think she wanted me to portray the state of the economy today. So let me describe, and this is something I describe in the book. But what we started to realize at the end of the Obama administration, all these reports started coming out. We started realizing that the level of concentration, that is the number of monopolists or oligopolists in the economy, that is industries just run by either one company or two or three companies, had reached unprecedented levels, maybe since, I don't know, maybe since the Gilded Age. And you can name the industry. Obviously, if you've been on an airplane lately, you've noticed there's like 3 major airlines, and somehow we let that all kind of come together. You may have noticed that most people have New York's a little different, but most of the country just have one cable provider who basically charges whatever price they feel like until people can't afford food anymore. The cable industry is essentially monopolized for most of the country. New York has a little bit of competition. It's a little different. The pharmaceutical industry has learned somehow that they can raise their prices really without any accountability, as far as I can tell. And clearly, the market doesn't control pharmaceutical pricing because no one is going to say, I'm not going to take that medicine and choose to die. I mean, and not to mention the complicated issues around insurance and doctors. It's a very broken market. So all across these industries, some of them are more obscure, chicken farming, agriculture. When I was in the White House, I was very obsessed with the beer industry because I'd noticed without a lot of fanfare, so the craft beer industry is great. I could do a whole talk on this, and they're about 25% of the market. But the rest of it, all the sort of lager beers, the Budweiser, all that they had kept consolidating until there was only 2 companies left. And then those 2 companies wanted to merge, just so there's one left. And we managed to effectively block it in the very end of the Obama administration, but it wasn't stopped in the rest of the world. So the rest of the world is beer. There's just like one beer company that runs, and there's all those beers you ever heard of that sort of taste similar. Sorry to But then, you know, sort of like the loggers from every country in the world are almost all owned by one single company, a Brazilian, Belgian brewer known as their InBev, AIB InBev. Anyway, so on and on and on, all these industries. And at the same time, we noticed that we noticed two things. We noticed that corporate profit had risen to unprecedented levels. We noticed that wages had been stagnating for 40 years, approximately. And then we finally, and we noticed that a percentage of national income going to employees versus shareholders and corporations had totally diverged. And all this kind of came together, and I think the feeling was like, oh my God, what do we do here? That maybe we were kind of just too bought into, you know, neoliberal, sort of the economic consensus of the 90s. And everyone was into sort of making the pie bigger, but we forgot about the part where you redistribute. You know, we never did the thing where, okay, we make America really rich, and then we change the tax code so the middle class gets a lot of that money. The money was kept. I'm not the first, that's obvious. But the part I'm talking about is the link of it to concentration. Let me talk about why I think concentration, I mean, many people in this room may already know the stuff, problems with inequality. I think they've become well known. Concentration, you know, monopoly, oligopoly, is sort of a root problem. Because if you want to do something, let's say about the tax code, well, you have to pass laws. Well, how do you pass laws? Well, you persuade legislators to do something. Well, who's good at doing that? The fact is that the smaller the industry is, the more concentrated. The political science suggests the more influential they are in government, the better they are at getting what they want. You know, pharmaceutical industry being a great example. That they're extremely organized. And so the more that the country is dominated by oligopoly and monopoly, the harder it is to get the political change you might want that might reverse some of these trends. So this is why it's a root problem. This is why I call for what I call for in the book is I think we need a new campaign of breakups. I think we need to really start breaking up some of these. And I'm not really a radical at all. You know, somehow this was a mainstream thing in the 1900s. This is a Republican and Democratic platform, is that all the trusts need to be broken. So it's only become radical over a century. And I think we need to go back to this American tradition. A big figure in the book is Louis Brandeis and his thoughts about what an economy is for. And so sort of presuming that Zephyr's not coming back, should I move it to questions? Or I don't know. What do you think? Should we do some questions? And if Zephyr comes back.
If you have a question, just raise your hand and I will bring you the mic.
Right in the front. I think you were here first, so you get that.
I'm just concerned about, you know, what China in the world market, how they move things. I mean, they seem to be a monopoly unto themselves, and they have tremendous effect on globally on how things are. How do we break them up?
Well, there's no that's hard. So we have kind of a natural experiment going on with China and the United States right now. China has adopted an economic program that honestly is not that much different than some of the European nations in the 1930s. I'm not going all the way towards saying that they've fully adopted a fascist economic program, but it's close. You know, they have national champions, they sponsor the champions, they want them to win. Government and their biggest companies are very allied. It's very difficult to do business in China. I did try to do business at one point there earlier in my life. You know, there's a reason the American companies keep losing. I don't think it's because their products are actually worse. So some people have said, and frankly, Mark Zuckerberg has said this a few times, and so have others in Silicon Valley. They say, well, listen, if we're facing China, what we need to do is make our companies stronger. You know, we need to not break up Facebook. We need to double down and make Facebook, you know, a fearsome monster that can take on China, and you know that's what we need to be doing. I sort of profoundly disagree with that thinking. I think it's because I think the union of public and private power is so dangerous. I think down that road, I don't mean to be an alarmist, but I think down that road leads to nationalism, if not fascism. I think it's really dangerous to have, let's just take one company, Facebook, and the federal government of the United States thinking themselves as close allies. And the reason is that they can insulate each other from all kinds of problems and wield a kind of power almost unprecedented. So let me give you an example. When we were in government, Facebook is always trying to be helpful because they want to be our friends in government. So they're like, we know, so they came over and they say something like, you know, we know what everybody's faces in the world looks like. So if you're looking for someone, let us know. Now they said this in the context of missing children, right? So that you're like, oh, well, that's great. Facebook will help. And everyone would agree it's great to find missing children and Facebook can help with that. But it sort of starts there and then it's like, well, let's find people who are accused of crimes. You know, see if you can find them somewhere. Or let's find people who are hostile to the government's program and see what they've been up to. Or let's find the political enemies of the president and see if there's any embarrassing. So you can see that pretty quickly, if you have a company which has spying powers that actually frankly transcend those of the CIA or the FBI, and you have government, and you have that combination, I think you have the possibility of a totalitarianism that we've never really fully witnessed. And actually, finally, in China, you can see some of this. The Chinese government has no hesitation in using every single private company to carry out a government will. You know, they have ratings for people. This is how dangerous they are politically. They do anything they can. So I think the Chinese example is to be resisted. Let me put it that way.
Tim, I kind of ended up here by accident in the sense that I've read your other 2.5, 3 books, and I was reading The Attention Merchants last week. I found you on Twitter, signed up, and see you have a new book out. So congratulations, it's great to be here.
Thank you.
My question, having read your other books and been very interested in kind of the stories that you kind of unpack and the onions you peel as you go through, how is this book related to the kind of arguments you made in your other books in terms of, the master switch and in terms of going after our attention? How does this book, in terms of bigness or the curse of bigness function, let's say in the world of telecom or in the world of the internet? You mentioned it briefly there, but could you talk about it in the sense of a series of your books?
That's an amazing question, very hard question. It, in the sense that the presumption there's some coherence in the center of it, or I have to try to reconcile what I've said all together. But I'll say a few things on that. I think the seeds of, I won't presume everyone's read all of my work, so I recommend them, and I believe they're for sale in the Strand bookstore. The seeds of this book were planted in The Master Switch. So the Master Switch is a book about the grand cycles of capitalism, basically. It's centered in the telecom and tech industries, but it's about these periods of openness and closedness which tend to happen. There's inventions of a new technology like the telephone or the radio. There's this sort of chaotic chase to figure out what works, and then something rises out of it, usually an oligopoly or a monopoly. So it's about that same kind of power that arises sort of naturally through this process of invention and development. And in a way, if you're a master switch aficionado, I'm talking about what you do to keep the cycle turning. I think we can't, in some ways this is getting into that internal mechanism of the master switch and saying we need to keep this cycle turning. We cannot accept this sort of private ruler. This book is obviously a lot more political. Right? This book is about, frankly, it's about power, and it's about the idea that's a constitutional idea of checks and balances, and that we do not accept any kind of unaccountable power. That's not in the Master Switch, but this is particularly focused on that problem of that unaccountable power. As for the attention merchants, I had to think a little harder about whether these two books are linked. In some ways, all of my books, I have in mind a trilogy, but this is not the third book in the trilogy. But I had in mind a trilogy about the 20th century, essentially. I think the 20th century was one we, first of all, we don't fully understand, nor do we understand how weird, strange it was. Just to take one example from the attention merchants. When I was writing the attention merchants, I was struck by this fact that, for about 30 years in the 20th century, there was this thing where after dinner, everybody in the country would sit down and basically watch the same program or something. Like, I Love Lucy would have like 70 or 80 million people watching it. I don't think something that has ever happened before and may never happen again. Because then, then everything, this invention of prime time. And now people all watch things, but they all watch their own things. You can, here we are all together. It's sort of unusual, but normally people are, in their own tiny little informational worlds. So just one example of how unusual the 20th century was. And I think in some ways this is an extension of that obsession of the 20th century. I'm interested in the errors we made in the 20th century, what we got right, and understanding that for the politics of the 21st century. And that's a little bit what this is about. Somebody else, maybe, who's that way in the back? Yeah, you in the far back.
Great. Hi, thank you so much for the talk. So I just have a question, and I think you sort of began alluding to this. So during the progressive era and during the New Deal, we were essentially able to arrive at a consensus that these oligopolies and monopolies needed to be broken up, and it was largely bipartisan, and antitrust laws were codified and largely enforced. But then you see in the 60s, 70s, 80s with the rise of neoliberalism and so forth, these laws begin getting rolled back. And so I'm wondering, even if we suppose that we reinvigorate the antitrust laws and we bring them back and we break up these monopolies and oligopolies again, what's to stop them from then slowly reforming, and then the America of the 2060s or 2070s, say, just arriving at the same problem? What do you think about the argument that potentially the issue is fundamentally that there's private control of certain industries, and perhaps certain industries should just be democratized in other ways, either through nationalization or through devolution to community organizations, employee run corporations, for instance, or something like that?
Yeah, I hear you. I guess I'm not... so I'm one of these people who believes in that almost encyclical... that history is cyclical. I mean, and I'm interested in grand cycles. And I'm sort of a kind of person that believes that many human systems can't be fixed, but only can be maintained. Right? I think that it's often, this, maybe by analogy to gardening. I don't know if this is too low or something, but you never like solve the weed problem. You sort of like, you manage it, and you realize when things have gone too far, and you sort of, and I don't think you ever sort of solve the economic problem with this sort of, the problem of how do you have an economy that does what you want. Nobody has ever solved that problem, and what you want, I think, is key. It's key to understand what you want, and I think we've lost sight of what the economy is for. It's a big part of this book, frankly, is that, and let me say a word on this, is that I think the economy should serve humanity first and foremost. That seems like a straightforward statement, but actually in its own way quite radical. We should be pursuing human ends, and it should serve as even the country and the economy as a place for people to flourish and develop character. And because these are Brandeis's ideas, also some of Jefferson's ideas. So I think the hope that you can kind of change one thing, undo one little trick, and then you solve the problem of making economy solve human ends. I think the 20th century also offers a negative example in that. I mean, most obviously through communism, is people thought, well, if we only get rid of this problem called private property, then we'll have solved it. And in the West, some people have sort of times felt that way about nationalizing things. We'll nationalize certain business out. And it's not that those aren't good ideas sometimes, and I think some businesses should be public run. There should be a lot of public options. But the idea that you sort of flick this switch, and then that will be it. That's what people thought. That's part of my resistance to the internet age too. Is I think we sort of thought, well, no, now business has been solved is different. We have companies like Google and Facebook. They operate more like charities. They give away stuff for free. That has solved all the problems. Fact is, I think you never solve problems, but you're constantly in this effort of trying to understand the cycles and moderate them so it's not too harsh on the people who live here. And if one of my daughters has to write The Curse of Bigness Revisited in 2050, that'll be a good thing. I mean, we may go through a period of reconcentration again, but if we understand ourselves better and are able to see, oh, we're having this problem arise again, let's deal with it again. That's what I think the best you can aim for in any human system.
Got another question over here, and then we'll take one more.
Oh yeah, okay.
Hi, thank you so much. So we've talked a little bit today about the tech industry and about the China argument for kind of consolidated monopolist industries. I'm curious, kind of departing from that, your take on the financial sector. To what extent is concentrated financial power critical to the projection of American power abroad? If that has a play in antitrust questions, and kind of moving, related to that point, is there anything you'd criticize about the Obama administration's response to 2008 that you think might be in any way responsible for the problems that we face today?
Yeah, so I am going to slightly demur on this because I'm not actually an expert on the financial industries. And they are very complicated. And also my wife happens to be an expert. And whenever she hears anything I say about it, she says, you really don't know what you're talking about. But I do know about antitrust. But finance is maybe I should be. So I don't have a full set of views upon this. I do think, I have some of my similar instincts, which I think that, now this gets a little bit almost to master switch stuff too, is I think there are certain industries that provide essentials, energy, communications, transportation, credit, and therefore in a very powerful and essential role in the economy. But because they're essential, they're always in a power to abuse that position. And in fact, it would seem to me, just from first principles, that you wouldn't want any of those industries to be particularly profitable, because they're like, if the subway were breaking a massive profit in the city, you'd be like, well, why is that happening? It's obviously someone, that wouldn't be a great thing. If Subway managed, let's say the Subway was privately owned and they would realize they could raise the price $20 because people got to get to their jobs. So one side of you would be, oh my God, look at that Subway. It's a terrific, look how profitable they are. It must be like they're just robbing people blind, right? So it seems to me the finance industry is kind of like the Subway, the unregulated prices, and that they have managed to take a lot more money from the economy than they should. Now, I realize it's not a very complicated view, but I do have this view when you're in a position of infrastructure that of this essential product, we have different views as to what you want from that sector. So those are my views, and as I said, I should next time have my wife come here and she'll give you something more sophisticated.
I'll take one more on the other side.
I guess it's not,
oh, sorry.
Sorry, sir.
Okay, so I'm curious whether you think that we currently have the tools necessary to kind of measure, bigness. Like, I've seen some of your thoughts on Facebook and Instagram, and if we measured it, if we actually measured like the time of people's focus, like, yeah, it's just speaking on the tools and maybe trying to not only focus on technology as an example, but expand a little more more wide.
Yeah, sure. So maybe I should say, maybe some people in this audience are a little more. I think there's a lot of different types of people in this audience, and some are maybe more technically inclined. And so I also write slightly more technical papers on some of the aspects of antitrust that I think need to improve, and this is one of them he's referring to. They're not. I think they're a good read, but I wouldn't necessarily say they're page turners. And what he's referring to is something where I said one of the problems. Let me tell you about the problem I'm referring to, and it'll make sense. So one of the mistakes I think we made in the Obama administration was allowing Facebook and Google to buy too many of their rivals. So if you wind back to Facebook, say circa 2012, there they were. They're about to IPO, and suddenly they faced a challenger, Instagram. New company. Instagram was growing faster than any company before. It looked like it was going to be the next Facebook, eat their lunch or whatever. And that was sort of the Silicon Valley ideas, like, you're around for 8 years and something new comes, and therefore you don't have to worry about anything. That was Zephyr was asking me about that earlier. But for someone, so Facebook suddenly had this epiphany, and like, why don't we just buy them? Then we don't have to worry about them competing with them. We'll just buy them. So they $1 billion seems like a lot to them, but it's not a lot to not have to deal with them, considering how much money there is in this market. So they bought them for $1 billion, and that kind of thing. And they did the same thing with WhatsApp, which some people may know, which had a global reach and was mobile, and also threatened to just become another social network. And they had a lot of users, and they paid $18 billion for them, which is actually, for an economist, should be like, ding, ding, why are they paying that much money? Maybe because they're going to split the monopoly profits afterwards. That's the usual inclination. So these are supposed to send warning bells in Washington, but we, and also Europe, the antitrust regulator is supposed to block anti-competitive mergers. The Standard Oil in the 19th century just bought up its competitors to create a huge monopoly. So Facebook. What went wrong? I've read the analysis. The American analysis is still secret. The British office released their analysis, and they said, well, Facebook doesn't really have a real important photo app, so they're not really competing with Instagram. Instagram, it's new. They haven't developed their advertising revenue, so they're not competing. So Facebook and Instagram are not competitors at all. That was their conclusion. A teenager could have told you differently. It takes, I think, many years of training to reach the conclusions that absurd. And so we basically let, and I think we suffered from it. Facebook is, managed to eliminate a lot of competition, and then felt it could be. There's an article in the New York Times, I think, coming out right now about how they've basically been kind of unaccountable. All this. We were chasing them down for privacy problems when I was in government, and they were like, oh yeah, we'll do better next time. And then they let the same things happen again, and they don't worry because they don't actually face any kind of competition. They don't feel any prospect of people really leaving. And there's more than one reason for that, and I'm not saying this should be regulated at all, but this calls for better measurement, calls for better techniques, but also does call for something very old, which is the kind of courage that says, we need to see what is going on here and stop it. One of the things I say in the books, I think retroactively it is actually, frankly, time to break up Facebook. I don't think it would be that hard. I think it would be better, and sort of send a warning shot to. I mean, they're not Silicon Valley's not the only industry, but the people need to reassert themselves and say, monopolization is illegal in this country. And we've basically abandoned these laws or let companies think they can act with impunity. And that's why I think things need to change. Are we out of time, or we want to do one more, or what do you?
We can take one more.
This gentleman seems to be quite eager, so
I'd like to ask you something about your colleague, Zephyr Teachout, wrote an article about Amazon.
This is not going to be an impolite question, is it?
No.
Okay.
She wrote an editorial about, Amazon didn't want them to come to Long Island City because he said he saw it as a threat to all the local merchants around that area. Your take on that analysis?
I could ask Zephyr to say what she wants. I'm not a big believer in corporate subsidies, so I don't think we shouldn't have paid. I believe in competition, actually, and And, you know, if they want to come here, come. If not, I don't think we need to subsidize them. That's my basic position on them. On the other hand, I'm somewhat, I'm not distressed for the economy of New York. It is a little bit more, I mean, I have two minds about it. I'm a New Yorker, right? So I do like the fact that I'm a New Yorker, and I like the fact that people are attracted to New York, think it's a great place. I mean, we have really talented people. So on the one hand, I'm happy. There's a part of me that, as an American, says, like, it's a little too bad the richest parts of the country are going to get richer again. But I am happy. I mean, I am happy that the company saw. I wish we didn't have to pay them for it, but I am happy they realized just how incredible the labor pool is in New York, and that they want to be here.
Well, thank you all for your questions, and Tim, thank you so much for writing the book and being here with us tonight.
Yeah.
Please give Tim a round of applause. And for Zephyr, even though she